No one challenged the gang leader in that prison yard. Not the guards standing near the fence, hands resting close to their radios. Not the inmates watching quietly from the benches. Not even the men twice his size who followed him everywhere he went. In that place, hierarchy was survival, and everyone knew exactly where they stood. The yard was loud but controlled. Weights clanged against concrete. Boots scraped the ground. Low conversations filled the air like static, constant, tense, never fully relaxed. Then the gates opened. A visitor stepped inside. Steven Seagal. No uniform, no weapon, no visible protection. Just a calm man walking across one of the most dangerous environments imaginable. Most inmates barely recognized him at first. To them, he wasn't a movie star. He wasn't a legend. He was simply an outsider. And outsiders didn't last long in places like this. From the far side of the yard, the gang leader noticed him. 6'5", built like a wall, covered in ink that told stories no one asked to hear. Where he walked, people shifted. Where he stood, conversations stopped. He watched Steven for several seconds, measuring him, judging him, deciding whether this moment was worth claiming. Then he moved. Each step towards Steven felt heavy, deliberate. His crew followed a few paces behind, spreading slightly, not threatening yet, but ready. The yard began to quiet. Even the weights slowed. The gang leader stopped directly in front of Steven and looked down at him. Up close. The size difference was impossible to ignore. He smirked, and then he said it, loud enough for the entire yard to hear. "I run this place." The words echoed across concrete and steel. A few inmates laughed under their breath. Others looked away, already knowing how this usually ended. This was the moment when visitors nodded politely. When they apologized, when they stepped aside and avoided trouble, that's what everyone expected. That's what always happened. Steven Seagal didn't move. No step back. No defensive posture. No nervous glance toward the guards. He simply stood there, still, breathing steady. Eyes calm. The silence that followed was heavier than shouting. Something felt wrong, not dangerous yet, but unfamiliar. The gang leader's smile faltered just slightly. 5 minutes later, the same men who had laughed would be standing quietly. The same yard that thrived on fear would feel different, and the man who claimed he ran everything would realize something painful. Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits. Have you ever seen someone speak with absolute confidence, not realizing they were standing in front of someone far more dangerous than they imagined? The prison yard was tense, but routine. High concrete walls wrapped around the space like a cage, stained by years of heat, dust, and silence. Barbed wire curved overhead, glinting under the pale daylight. Every corner carried eyes. Hundreds of inmates filled the yard, each pretending not to watch, while watching everything. This was not chaos. It was order of a different kind. An order built on reputation, history, and unspoken rules. Men lifted weights made from welded metal. Others paced slowly in circles, counting steps as if time itself could be controlled. Small groups stood together, speaking quietly, never saying more than necessary. Here, attention was dangerous. Looking too long meant challenge. Looking away too fast meant weakness. Everyone understood that balance. Into this environment walked Steven Seagal. He wasn't escorted like a celebrity. There were no cameras, no special treatment. Just 2 correctional officers nearby, close enough to observe, far enough not to interfere. Steven wore plain clothes. Nothing that stood out. Nothing that announced who he was. No uniform. No weapons. No authority badge. In this place, that meant one thing. He had no power, on paper. He was simply a visitor participating in a rehabilitation and self-discipline program. A short session meant to introduce concepts of control, responsibility, and restraint. To the administration, it was educational. To the inmates, it was entertainment. A stranger stepping into their world. Most of them didn't know his background. They didn't know the years of discipline, the training, the mindset built through decades of control. They judged only what they could see. A middle-aged man, calm posture, quiet movements. Samanu, who didn't look like he belonged in a prison yard. As Steven walked, conversations shifted. Some inmates leaned closer to one another, whispering. Others watched from a distance, measuring his walk, his breathing, his awareness. In prison, people learn to read details. Who scans the room, who keeps their hands relaxed, who doesn't panic under pressure. Steven moved slowly, not cautious, not careless, intentional. He didn't stare. He didn't avoid eye contact either. He acknowledged space without claiming it. That alone confused people, because in the yard, men usually did one of two things. They tried to dominate, or they tried to disappear. Steven did neither. He simply existed calmly. In a place that punished calmness, from the benches near the fence, older inmates watched him carefully. They'd seen visitors before, motivational speakers, former athletes, men who talked big for 15 minutes and left untouched. Those visitors always carried fear beneath their words. Steven didn't. There was no tension in his shoulders, no rush in his steps, no need to announce himself. That quiet confidence unsettled the yard more than shouting ever could, because this place was built on pressure. And anyone who could walk through it without absorbing that pressure was not ordinary. To most inmates, though, he still looked like an outsider. Simoning passing through, Simonin temporary. Simone who didn't belong, and in places like this, outsiders are always tested. The gang leader noticed him immediately. In a place like this, certain people develop a sixth sense, an instinct for anything that doesn't belong. Steven Seagal stood out not because he was loud, but because he wasn't. The gang leader rose slowly from the bench near the center of the yard. 6'5", shoulders wide, arms layered in tattoos that marked rank, loyalty, and past violence. The men around him shifted the moment he moved. Some stepped back, others followed. Not because they were told to, but because they knew. Where he went, power followed. He walked straight towards Steven and stopped directly in front of him, blocking his path. Close enough to feel breath, close enough to intimidate. "You lost," the gang leader said. His voice wasn't angry. It was casual. That made it worse. The yard reacted instantly. Weights stopped clanking. Footsteps slowed. Conversations faded into nothing. Even the guards stiffened slightly, not intervening, just watching carefully. Everyone understood what this moment was. This wasn't a fight. It was a test. The gang leader tilted his head, studying Steven from top to bottom. No fear, no hesitation. That annoyed him. So he smiled, a crooked, confident grin, and spoke louder, making sure the entire yard could hear. "I run this place," he said. "Everyone here answers to me." The words echoed off concrete walls. A few inmates laughed quietly, more out of habit than humor. Others leaned forward on their benches, anticipation tightening their faces. They had seen this scene before. A visitor gets checked. The visitor backs down. The hierarchy stays intact. That's how it always went. Steven didn't respond. He didn't argue. Didn't defend himself. Didn't look toward the guards. Instead, he slowly looked around the yard, not scanning for danger, observing. He noticed the way men stood in clusters, how some watched with curiosity, others with hunger, how the gang leader's followers waited for a signal that never came. Then Steven returned his eyes to the man in front of him, and said nothing. The silence stretched. 1 second, 2, long enough to become uncomfortable. That quiet pressed down harder than yelling ever could. The gang leader's smile faded slightly. In prison, silence can mean many things. Fear, defiance, or something far more dangerous. Confidence. Steven's calm didn't look accidental. It looked chosen. The gang leader shifted his stance, irritated. Most men rushed to explain themselves. Most tried to prove they deserved respect. Steven didn't try at all. That unsettled the yard. Because power here was loud. It puffed its chest. It announced itself. And this man. Didn't a guard subtly adjusted his footing? Several inmates exchanged glances. The air felt different now. Tighter, heavier. Like something invisible had entered the space. The gang leader leaned in slightly. "Did you hear me?" he asked. Still nothing. Steven simply held his gaze. Not challenging, not submissive. Present. The gang leader straightened, jaw tightening. He wasn't used to being ignored. In this yard, disrespect wasn't usually spoken. It was felt. and for the first time in a long while, he felt it, not from insults, not from defiance, but from silence. The kind that doesn't ask permission, the kind that waits. Have you ever seen silence command more attention than threats? Steven understood the danger instantly. This wasn't a movie set. There were no cameras. No second takes. No controlled environment. This wasn't a dojo either. A place built on rules, respect, and tradition. This was a real prison yard. A place where pride decided survival. Where hesitation invited attack. Where one wrong decision could spiral into chaos in seconds. Steven felt the weight of it immediately, the eyes on him. The tension tightening across the concrete, the invisible pressure pushing him toward the obvious choice. He could walk away. That's what everyone expected. Visitors always did. They smiled politely. They avoided confrontation. They told themselves it wasn't worth it. Even the guards waited for it. The small step back, the quiet retreat that would end the moment safely. Because here, walking away wasn't cowardice. It was procedure. Steven stood still, feeling the silence stretch around him. He thought of why he was there. Not for attention, not for recognition, not to prove anything. He was there to teach something most of these men had never learned. Discipline. Not discipline forced by walls or punishment, but discipline that begins inside. Walking away would protect him, but it would teach nothing. And teaching was the reason he had stepped into this yard in the first place. The gang leader watched him closely now. Waiting, almost certain the moment was about to end, Steven inhaled slowly, then exhaled, not to prepare for a fight, but to steady himself. He took one slow step forward, not aggressive, not rushed, not confrontational, just intentional. That single step sent a ripple through the yard. A few inmates shifted on their feet. Someone whispered, "What's he doing?" A guard subtly reached toward his radio. Steven stopped just short of the gang leader, close enough to speak, not close enough to threaten. He looked up calmly. No anger in his eyes, no challenge in his posture. Only certainty, and then he spoke. "Number you don't." The words were quiet. Almost gentle, but they landed like weight. The yard froze, not metaphorically, literally. No laughter, no movement. No sound except the distant hum beyond the walls. The gang leader blinked. He hadn't expected that. People argued with him sometimes. People pleaded. People tried to explain. No one corrected him. Steven's voice hadn't risen, but it didn't need to. Because confidence doesn't shout. The gang leader's jaw tightened. Around them, the men who usually filled space with noise stood motionless. They were watching something unfamiliar. Not dominance, not submission, control. Steven didn't follow up his words. Didn't explain himself. Didn't justify anything. He simply stood there, grounded, balanced, unmoved. As if he wasn't standing in a prison yard at all, as if fear had no authority over him. The gang leader searched his face, trying to find something. Nerves, doubt, regret. He found none. For the first time since taking control of the yard, uncertainty crept in, because power usually came with aggression, and this man showed none. That made him unpredictable. Steven felt the tension but didn't react to it. Inside, he knew exactly what he was risking. One wrong response could ignite violence. One insult could turn the yard against him. But discipline meant accepting that risk, not to dominate, not to humiliate, but to show that strength could exist without cruelty. The yard waited. Seconds stretched long. Everyone sensed it. This moment would decide everything. Not with fists, not with force, but with the choice Steven had just made. To stand firm, calmly, in a place that fed on fear. And nothing unsettled the yard more than that. The gang leader laughed, but it wasn't real laughter. It came out sharp, forced, the kind used to hide irritation rather than confidence. A few of his men joined in half a second later, not because it was funny, but because they were expected to. That alone changed the energy. Their laughter sounded hollow. The gang leader took a step sideways, then another, not backing away, repositioning. His crew responded instantly, spreading out across the yard in a loose arc. Not a threat yet. A reminder, guards noticed immediately. One officer shifted his stance. Another placed a hand near his radio. A quiet crackle cut through the air. The yard felt tighter now, like the walls had moved closer. "This isn't Hollywood," the gang leader said, his voice louder than before. "You don't talk to me like that here." His tone sharpened on the last word. "Here." As if the yard itself belonged to him. Steven met his eyes without hesitation. There was no anger in his face. No fear either. Just calm awareness. "I don't need to," Steven replied. The words were simple, but they landed hard. The gang leader's jaw tightened instantly. That response wasn't defiance. It was dismissal. And dismissal was something he wasn't used to. Around them, the inmates sensed the shift. This was no longer a test. This was becoming a struggle, not of strength, but of presence. The gang leader flexed his hands slowly, fingers curling into fists. Muscles tightened along his arms. His breathing changed. 5 minutes earlier, he believed he controlled everything in that yard. The schedules, the movement, the silence. Men avoided his eyes, guards tolerated him. Fear worked in his favor, but now, something felt different. Steven wasn't impressed. He wasn't intimidated. And more unsettling than that, he wasn't trying to win. He stood perfectly still, weight evenly balanced, posture relaxed. Not defensive, not aggressive, prepared. That readiness unsettled everyone watching. Because most men in conflict give signals, tension in the shoulders, aggression in the eyes, emotion leaking through the body. Steven gave none. It was as if the pressure of the yard couldn't reach him. The gang leader glanced briefly to his right, just for a moment, checking his men. They were there. But they hesitated. Not because they feared Steven, because something about this moment felt wrong. Instinct told them that escalating this would change the yard forever. The gang leader felt that hesitation, and it infuriated him. "You think you're different?" he snapped. "You think calm makes you untouchable?" Steven didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence returned. Heavier now, layered with expectation. Even the guards stopped shifting. Everyone understood that something irreversible hovered just beneath the surface. This was the point where shouting usually started. Where someone tried to reassert dominance. Where pride demanded reaction. The gang leader stepped closer again. Close enough to feel heat. He leaned slightly forward, eyes narrowed. "You're standing in my world," he said. "You don't get to correct me." Steven finally spoke again, quietly. "Then why are you trying so hard to prove it?" The words struck deeper than insult ever could, because they exposed the truth. Power that needs proving is already unstable. The gang leader froze. For half a second, confusion crossed his face. Not fear, something worse. Doubt, around them. Inmates exchanged glances. They had never seen anyone speak to him like this. Not with disrespect, but with clarity. Steven wasn't challenging his authority. He was questioning its foundation. The gang leader straightened sharply, trying to recover. His voice rose. "Inna," he said, but the word lacked weight. The yard felt it. Because control doesn't disappear loudly. It slips, quietly. And everyone could feel it slipping from his grasp. 5 minutes ago, he owned the moment. Now the moment was owning him. Steven stood exactly where he had been from the start, still calm, unmoved. The pressure in the yard thickened until it was almost unbearable. Something had to happen next. Not because Steven wanted it. Not because the gang leader planned it, but because tension, once stretched this far, never releases gently. Steven raised one hand slightly, not fast, not sharp, just enough for the movement to be noticed. The yard reacted instantly. A few inmates stiffened. One guard leaned forward. Several men held their breath without realizing it, but Steven wasn't preparing to strike. He wasn't attacking. He was demonstrating. He turned his body just a few degrees. A subtle shift of balance most people wouldn't even recognize. Then he spoke quietly, so only the men closest to him could hear. "Power isn't noise," he said. "It's control." His voice carried no pride, no warning, only certainty. He gestured toward the gang leader's stance, not mocking, not correcting harshly, simply explaining. "You're standing heavy on your front foot," Steven said calmly. "That means you're already off balance." The gang leader frowned. He hadn't moved. Yet, somehow, he felt exposed. Steven took a slow step to the side, not entering his space, not touching him, just repositioning. From here, Steven continued, you don't need strength. You just need timing. He demonstrated the motion in the air. Smooth, minimal, precise. No contact, no aggression. But something remarkable happened. The men watching understood, not intellectually. Instinctively, they saw how little effort it took. How unnecessary violence suddenly looked. This wasn't a technique meant to impress. It was restraint made visible. The yard was silent now. Even the wind seemed to pause. The gang leader swallowed. For the first time since approaching Steven, he didn't feel tall. He felt unstable. Not because he was being threatened, but because he realized how easily the situation could be ended if Steven chose to. And that choice, the refusal to act, carried more weight than action ever could. Steven lowered his hand. I'm not here to embarrass you, he said. And I'm not here to take anything from you. He looked around briefly at the men watching, the guards, the concrete walls. I'm here to show that control isn't taken, he continued. It's earned. The gang leader took a small step back, not dramatic, barely noticeable. But in a prison yard, it meant everything. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Not sound, but awareness. Something had shifted. The gang leader's men looked at him, confused. They were waiting for a signal for anger, for aggression, for escalation. It never came. Instead, the gang leader hesitated. For the first time, he hesitated. His fists loosened slightly. His breathing slowed. He glanced around the yard and saw something he hadn't seen before. No fear, no excitement, just observation. They weren't waiting for a fight. They were watching a lesson. Steven remained still. Not advancing, not retreating, allowing space. Because true authority doesn't trap, it gives room. You can keep control by force, Steven said quietly, but it never lasts. The words weren't aimed at one man anymore. They were aimed at the yard itself. Or, he added, you can keep it by discipline. The gang leader said nothing. His mouth opened, then closed again. There was nothing to say. Because every response he considered would have sounded weak. Anger would expose insecurity. Violence would prove the point. Silence was the only option left. So he took another step back, then stopped. The yard remained perfectly still. No cheers, no reactions, just understanding. The guards didn't intervene. They didn't need to. Whatever line had been approached, it had already passed safely. Steven gave a small nod, not in victory. In closure, he turned slightly, signaling the moment was over. And no one stopped him. Not the gang leader, not his crew, not the yard. Because dominance had not been taken from anyone. It had simply been redefined. In that silence, everyone learned the same truth. The most dangerous person is not the one who threatens. It's the one who doesn't need to. The guards finally moved in. Not in a rush, not with urgency, not to restrain Steven, but to gently separate the moment before it became something else. One officer stepped between the two men, calm but alert. Another gestured quietly toward the gang leader. There were no orders shouted, no hands drawn, no alarms triggered. Because there was nothing left to control. The moment had already passed. The gang leader stood still for a second longer. He didn't speak, didn't threaten, didn't argue, didn't try to reclaim the space. His eyes lingered on Steven, not with anger this time, but with something unfamiliar, recognition. Then he turned. Without a word, he walked away. His men followed behind him automatically, but their energy had changed. They weren't puffed up anymore. They weren't loud. They were quiet, and that silence followed them across the yard. Steven didn't watch them leave. He didn't need to. He simply turned back toward the center of the yard, toward the reason he had come in the first place. The program continued. No speeches, no dramatic pause, just discipline. He spoke calmly to the inmates who had gathered nearby, explaining posture, breathing, awareness, the fundamentals of control. Some listened with curiosity, some with skepticism, but all of them listened. Because something had shifted. The yard felt different now, not safer, not softer, just steadier. Later that day, Conversations spread quietly from group to group. Not about a fight, not about dominance, but about what hadn't happened. No punches thrown. No humiliation. No violence. Yet, everyone had felt the outcome, for years. The yard had operated on one belief: the loudest man survives, the angriest man leads, the one who instills fear stays in control. That belief cracked that afternoon. Not loudly, not publicly, but permanently, because they had witnessed something rare. A man who didn't need permission, didn't need approval, didn't need fear. He didn't demand respect. He embodied it. Even the guards noticed. Not because policy changed, but because the energy did. Men stood a little farther apart. Voices dropped slightly, postures softened just enough to breathe. It wasn't peace, but it was awareness. And awareness is where discipline begins. By the end of the day, Steven walked out the same way he had entered. Quietly. No applause. No recognition. Just a nod from one of the officers. That was enough. Because the lesson had landed, not through authority, not through force, but through presence. In a place built on intimidation, something else had proven stronger. Control that yard learned a truth most never forget. The man who needs to say, "I run this place," usually isn't the one who does, because real power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't shout. It doesn't posture. It doesn't need witnesses. Real power stays calm when others panic. It chooses restraint when chaos would be easier, and it leaves impact without leaving scars. That day, no one was defeated. Yet everyone learned, and sometimes that's the strongest outcome of all. Final engagement comment driver. If you believe real power is calm, not intimidation, type respect in the comments, and tell me, who do you think truly runs a place, the loudest voice, or the calmest mind?